Hey, what's up you guys? How you doing today? My name is Kylie if this is your first time here, and today we're doing something that I haven't done in forever. I'm gonna be talking about 5 movies that I have watched recently on Shudder. This is not sponsored, I wish, but Shudder is a streaming service with all things horror related on it if you haven't heard of it. But if you do have a Shudder, I have some really good movies to recommend to you, and one of them actually is not a Shudder original, so you could probably rent it on Prime or something. Before I start the video, 2 things. Number 1, this really cute cropped pink, oops, my phone fell. This really cute cropped Pink Floyd little t-shirt is going to be for sale on my Poshmark. I love it, but it's like getting a little bit too small for me now. If your significant other is petite and they like more feminine clothing, then boy do I have good news for you. Because like half of my closet is on Poshmark for sale right now, as well as some movies that I'm getting rid of if you're interested. And the second thing is I do have a Patreon account. If you want to join my first tier, then you get early access to all of my content. If you join the second tier, then you get access to all of my extra bonus content. But without further ado, let's get on with today's video, because the first movie that I have to talk about today I'm so excited about. I know it's usually better to save the best for last. I did save my second favorite for last, but this one I just had to talk about. So this movie, now streaming on Shudder, is called Coherence. It came out in 2013 and received an 88%, and if you're not familiar, here's the rundown on the movie. 8 friends at a dinner party experience a troubling chain of events due to the malevolent influence of a passing comet. Okay, so I'll get into my spoiler-free review and stuff, but I have to go over the fun facts because I think that the fun facts and how they made this movie is the most interesting part of it. They had to rely on a low budget of just $50,000, and they shot it in only 5 nights, and most of the dialogue was improvised. Instead of scripts, the actors would receive just like a paragraph about what their characters' intentions were for that particular scene. So this allowed the story to unfold a little bit more naturally, and you got more genuine reactions from the actors. Because nobody else knew what everyone else's intentions were, they just knew what they had to kind of accomplish, like what their goal was for the end of the scene. So an example of this is when one of the characters wants to leave the house, it's the goal of one of the other characters to not let them leave. So by all means, they were supposed to accomplish those goals, and so it's really interesting to see how it plays out because their motivations really drive them. And they also have no idea what the other character is going to do, so it feels really genuine. So the actor who played Amir was actually one of the co-writers of this movie. He served kind of as a mole, if you will, because he helped the actors get back on track in the scene if they weren't going the direction that the writers wanted them to. This was directed by James Ward Burkett, who I believe was also one of the writers, and he said that the hardest part of filming this movie was keeping people quiet because everybody was compelled to speak a lot. Because the dialogue obviously wasn't written, so people would just speak whenever they wanted to, like they would speak out of turn. But it actually makes it feel like you're at a real dinner party, because at a real dinner party, not just one person is talking at one time, like everybody chatters. This movie was also shot chronologically, which if you're not a filmmaker, that is like really impressive, and it's a very rare thing. The set also only had 5 crew members. They had the director of photography, the director, producer, and 2 sound guys. The director also wanted to shoot this movie at his own house, but because his wife was 8.5 months pregnant and wanted to have a home birth, she made him agree to get it shot in 5 days. The filmmakers also have never revealed how the comet was filmed, but they did say that it was made with practical effects. When the characters venture outside, the neighborhood is actually supposed to look completely dark, but because a Snickers commercial was being filmed on the same night, they weren't quite able to accomplish this. Because in the commercial, they used huge lights and hundreds of people. The cinematography of this movie is also interesting. It's really shaky and kind of a little bit hard to get used to, but the reason that they did this and why it was all kind of handheld was because it was improvised. So this allowed the actors to have more free range of motion. They could go wherever they wanted and wherever it felt natural. So that's why the cinematography doesn't feel great, but again, I think it lends itself to the realism. The director first met Lauren Maher, who plays the character of Lori in this movie, on the set of Pirates of the Caribbean, The Black Pearl. She played Scarlett, who is the wench that slaps Johnny Depp. They did have to reshoot some scenes over 6 months later, but Lorraine Scafaria, who played Lee, had changed her hair pretty drastically at that point, so they spent $8,000 on a wig that replicated her hair from the beginning of the movie. And $8,000 is how much they spent on their first whole day of shooting. They spent that much on a wig. Okay, now getting to my review, just please watch this movie. It's a psychological thriller. It's not so much of a horror, but it is very suspenseful. And my eyes were also glued to the screen. I love sci-fi. I love trying to figure out what trippy stuff is going on. And this movie does take you on a trip. I'm not going to spoil absolutely anything because I think it's best to go into it blind. But knowing how it was made, I'm hoping it'll give you more appreciation for the movie, because admittedly at first I was a little bit annoyed by the cinematography. I was a little bit annoyed by everybody talking over one another, but ultimately I did find the film to be brilliant. This movie also definitely brings up a lot of questions of morality, because it's kind of one of those situations where characters find themselves trapped in a sticky situation person. So I love that because that also creates a lot of tension between the characters. There's also some confusion in this movie. A lot of it is left up for you to decide what's going on, but ultimately you do get the answers that you need. Except the ending is a little bit ambiguous, but I think in the best way possible because you can pretty much gather what's going to happen once the credits roll. They leave you on somewhat of a cliffhanger. Like, this film does not need a sequel by any means, but I would watch one, to be honest, just to see how the events of like what happens at the end of the movie unfold. And they were able to accomplish so much just using this one location. Like, this movie feels like the scope is much larger than it actually is. And all the filming techniques and everything that they used, like all their practical effects and everything, were brilliant. But you do have to pay attention to it. This is a movie that you really need to pay attention to and to like gather everything that's going on and to follow the plot. So that being said, I don't know if this movie will be for everybody, but I absolutely loved it. I love when movies get my mind working. I love when characters feel so grounded in reality. I loved almost like the kind of found footagey feel of the movie. It was really tense, and this was by far my favorite movie that I was going to talk about today. So if you're into sci-fi, if you're into thrillers, I implore you to watch this. Okay, up next, everybody has been buzzing about this movie all over Twitter, and so I decided to watch it. The movie is called Hunted. This is a Shudder original that just recently came out, I believe in 2020. It has 4 out of 5 skulls on Shudder, but it was rated at a 63% on Rotten Tomatoes. What started as a flirtatious encounter at a bar turns into a life or death struggle as Eve becomes the unknowing target of a misogynistic plot against her. Forced to flee as 2 men pursue her through the forest, she's pushed to her extremes while fighting to survive in the wilderness. But survival isn't enough for Eve. She will have revenge. Because this is a brand new movie and because it's a Shudder original, I actually don't have any fun facts about this one. So getting straight into my review, this was not a fun time, and I just want to speak to the synopsis a little bit because it feels kind of inaccurate. Yes, this movie has some kind of weird and like diluted anti-misogyny themes, but they don't come through very clearly because this film feels like it's catering to sexual abusers. Ooh, like I didn't want to, okay. I didn't want to say that, but like I don't really know who else would enjoy this movie. It's not really a revenge movie. I don't know why that's part of the synopsis, like she will have revenge, like because ultimately most of the movie is them just like fighting and like running away in the forest, then they find her again, and then it just like it keeps happening over and over. It's not a very dynamic story. A lot of it is actually kind of disjointed because in the beginning the movie kicks off with this weird like fairy tale kind of Deathly Hallows Part 1 type of moment. Do you know what I'm talking about? That like animated moment when Hermione is reading the story in Deathly Hallows? That's gorgeous. So they did a really cheap kind of knockoff silhouette-y kind of version of that in this movie. Wasn't a fan of that, and ultimately it did not have much to do with the story at all. What is that? What is that? There was a helicopter very close to my house because the main purpose of that opening story moment was kind of to like set up the message of the story. But it's like, why would you do that? Because like in the beginning, the message of that story is kind of that like the company of wolves is better than the company of men. Like men are the real monsters, you know? Why would they set that up in the very beginning? Because like, it's just, I don't know, it's like a little bit too easy, a little too obvious. I don't think we needed that opening narration story moment. It wasn't necessary. Like just start the movie where the story begins. So I feel like I need to backtrack because I said that this movie seems like it might be kind of catered to sexual abusers. And the reason I say that is because this movie is supposed to be like anti-misogyny, but a lot of the imagery was like really triggering for me. It was stuff that I really didn't want to see. They like depicted women being abused and like it was a lot more suggestive, which I can appreciate that they didn't like full out do that. But also like the dialogue that was layered on top of it was really disgusting and just it made me so uncomfortable. And yes, okay, horror is supposed to make you uncomfortable. Not like this though. I hope you follow what I mean by that because I don't think it should be the goal of a horror movie to trigger people. So I wasn't uncomfortable in a sort of delighted, horrified way. I was uncomfortable in like a, oh, this could absolutely happen to me kind of way. So in a sense, this movie was terrible. I don't need movies that are about sexual assault. I don't think anyone needs that. I think honestly the only people that need to see stories like this are people that are just like completely oblivious to the dangers that like women face. But I think most people are aware of that by now. Otherwise, I have no idea who the audience for this movie is supposed to be. It's also described is a dark Red Riding Hood story, and that does not come through at all. Like, okay, you put this woman in a red coat. Okay, there's a story in the beginning about a woman who joins a pack of wolves. Like, okay. And again, that story moment was never called back later in the movie. Like, I don't know if our main character woman was supposed to represent the woman in the story because their stories didn't line up whatsoever. And like I said, I think the point of the movie was to kind of prove that like men are the monsters and like wolves are just a force of nature or whatever. That's all fine and good. I just wish that the connection with the actual story itself and the prologue was less abstract. There were a couple of positives for this movie though. I will say that the body horror was actually really good. It was very realistic and it was shot pretty well. I think that the cinematography was interesting, but the best thing about this movie was definitely the gore, and I don't even really like gore. So I appreciate the talent that went into this movie. I just have no idea who the intended audience was supposed to be. Like, who enjoys movies about sexual assault other than abusers? I don't know. I guess women can when the actual plot about revenge is a lot stronger and like that's the focal point, but it wasn't. I don't know why this is marketed as a revenge movie. It's really not. It's about her being hunted in the forest. And I think it's just a little bit cheap to include that it's a revenge story in the synopsis because it's not. There are some cool fight sequences with her and like even a little bit of humor depending on how you look at it. So I won't say that this movie is completely unredeemable, but I think it is definitely my least favorite movie that I'm going to share with you guys today. Okay, moving on from that, I want to talk about the movie called Mayhem, which is another Shudder original that came out in 2017. This movie received an 84% on Rotten Tomatoes. Derek Cho is having a really bad day. After being unjustly fired from his job, he discovers that the law firm's building is under quarantine for a mysterious and dangerous virus. Chaos erupts throughout the office as the victims of the disease begin acting out their wildest impulses. Joining forces with a former client who has a grudge of her own, Derek savagely fights tooth and nail to get to the executives on the top floor and settle the score once and for all. Okay, so right off the bat, this movie stars one of my favorite actresses, Samara Weaving. It also stars Dallas Roberts and Stephen Yeun, who are both from The Walking Dead. And I'm a big fan of Glenn. I made it to like the 5th season of The Walking Dead and then I just couldn't keep going. I don't know, I got bored. But I will try to finish that someday, I swear. So I do have some fun facts about this one, and this first one, I don't think it's true. It's on IMDb and no one has removed it, so you know what, do with this information what you will. I don't really think it's true. So in this movie, this virus leads people to just be controlled by their id, so they just act out their wildest impulses. So 2 extras in the background were having sex, and apparently they were having sex in real life because they're a couple. No idea if that's true. I hope to God that it is not. The office building that they shot this movie in is only 3 stories high, whereas in the movie it looks like a giant skyscraper. The prep time for this movie was also only 5 weeks. I don't know if that includes script writing, probably not, but still everything else with pre-production takes so much time. I don't know how they did that. And when you watch the movie, you can kind of get the sense that it was rushed because it doesn't quite feel complete and it's hard to put your finger on why. So this is one of those movies on Shudder that had potential and it's kind of on the cusp of being really great, but it actually just fell completely flat. And that's saying something because I love the actors in this movie, but something about this movie was just not it. At times, a few of the moments in the movie really landed for me. Like some of the fight scenes, I was like, yeah, yes! I was like, wow, my id is being represented. This is how I wish I could live sometimes. But for the most part, it really just fell off. I know it's not really supposed to be a realistic movie by any means because all these people are being controlled by their id, but it just seems a little bit inconsistent because when you're watching the movie, sometimes the characters are acting completely crazy and just giving into their impulses, and sometimes they're not. They still seem really well controlled. So it's a little confusing because this virus they have is supposed to be tapping into their most primal instincts, and yet at times the characters still feel completely like themselves. Also with this disease, this movie feels a little bit touchy just given our current circumstances, because as they were kind of doing the opening narration and describing the nature of this virus and how the country was handling it and stuff, it felt super meta and like it wasn't supposed to, but it did. It kind of like brought the real world into the movies for me, and it was tripping me out. Because sometimes when you watch movies and you relate to a character or the situation and you're like, oh, my life feels like a movie, and this time it did as well, but not in a good way, because I was like, oh, my life is just like a horror movie now. I think that the performances of Stephen Yeun and Samara Weaving are actually really good in this movie. My hair looks so interesting right now. So it's really weird, and that's why I say that it was on the cusp of being a really great movie, but like it just fell flat for some reason. I think it might be the writing, because I also really like the character arcs that we go through. I like the relationships that are built throughout the movie. I guess perhaps it just like wasn't as fun as I wish it would have been. It felt almost a little bit too serious, and I think with this kind of concept where you have people in an office building being controlled by their most primal instincts and like killing each other and everything, I think you kind of have to play up the humor of that, and they like did did a little bit, but it was just a little bit too serious for me, I think. So if you're into this concept and you don't like dark comedies, you might like this movie. Also, it might have been trying to be funny, but like the writing just wasn't good, so I don't know. It was just a little bit off. So all that being said, I'm gonna move on to the next movie, and that will be the Mortuary Collection that came out last year. This received a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes, and here's the synopsis. Desperate for work, a young drifter applies for a job at the local mortuary on the outskirts of town. There she meets Montgomery Dark, an eccentric mortician with more than a few skeletons in his closet. Montgomery chronicles the strange history of the town through a series of twisted tales, each more terrifying than the last. So the mortuary where they shot this is actually the Flavel House Museum in Astoria, Oregon. So that's super cool. I really hope that I can visit it when I do my road trip up to Oregon whenever that happens. Scenes that took place outside were also filmed in this town of Astoria, which is also where the Not the Goosebumps, The Goonies was filmed. Caitlin Fisher, who played Sam in this movie, was 7 months pregnant while filming some of these scenes. And finally, Clancy Brown's makeup took 2.5 hours to apply and 1 hour to remove. Alright, moving on to the review. So with this movie, I didn't really go in with any expectations, although this is a movie that I had been anticipating for a while. This is an original movie that Shudder spent quite a bit of time on promo with. I saw a bunch of advertisements for it on YouTube and on Instagram and stuff like that, so I had been anticipating it, but because Shudder movies are so hit and miss for me, I went in with like no expectations. And I actually really liked it. A lot of Shudder content has this kind of undeniable quality to it that I can't really put my finger on, but Mayhem has it as well. I think that maybe it's just because everything that Shudder does is kind of always on the brink of being great, but it always just is like a little bit mediocre. And this movie definitely has that vibe to it. This is an anthology movie, and some of the stories I was like, okay, that was just a little bit more weird than horrifying, but they get a lot better as you progress through the movie. Like, they keep getting better and better, so it is worth it to watch till the end. There's also a really big twist at the end of the movie that I didn't see coming, and I loved it. I thought it was actually really well executed. A lot of the movie does feel kind of like incoherent babble. Like, some of the stories really are not very good, and I ultimately didn't love the movie until the very end. Like, the first couple stories are just not that enjoyable, and it feels a little bit more juvenile. It feels more like you're watching episodes of the Goosebumps, but for that reason, I think that the movie is actually really entertaining. Like, if you can look past kind of how weird things are, you might like it. I mean, I think it's fun, and the twist, I guarantee, is great, and you won't see it coming. So I do recommend that one. But moving on to the last movie I want to talk about today, and that is the Shudder original called Haunt. This movie came out in 2019, received a 70% on Rotten Tomatoes, and here's the synopsis. On Halloween, a group of friends encounter an extreme haunted house that promises to feed on their darkest fears. The night turns deadly as they come to the horrifying realization that some nightmares are real. So I actually only found a couple of fun facts on this one, but they are very interesting. So the filmmakers Scott Beck and Brian Woods wrote the script for Haunt while they were also working on the script for A Quiet Place, and they wrote them without the expectation that either film would ever get made. So congrats, you guys. And again, I don't know if this one is true. I'm gonna go ahead and say it's alleged just because it's kind of a serious thing. But apparently production was halted when someone was stabbed near the Cal Poly Pomona campus. So there's that. This movie actually really exceeded my expectations. Granted, because this is a Shudder original, my expectations weren't too high, but I was actually incredibly gripped by this movie. It's definitely more of a body horror slasher movie, which typically are not necessarily my favorite, but this film was actually shot in like low lighting. The gore looked really good, and I was actually like, alright. This is, I think, one of the only movies where I really enjoy the gore, because I'm really not into gore for the most part. I prefer when things are more understated. And maybe it's just because I'm used to gore now because I've like broadened my horror horizons. But even though it was more of a body horror slasher, it did such an excellent job of setting up the atmosphere of the movie, which I think a lot of slashers kind of lack, because most slashers are more about like the gore and kills. It's of my opinion that it's actually kind of rare for a slasher to set up a good atmosphere that actually is creepy and makes you feel tense, because usually you know what's gonna happen in a slasher and you're just waiting to see the creative kills. In this movie though, I actually cared about the characters, which is not common for slashers, and that definitely helped, because like the women were not just like vapid sex objects. One of them was a nurse. They were actually really decent fleshed out characters, and they weren't the strongest characters, but they were really strong considering their ultimate purpose in the movie. The coloring of this movie was also great, and not in a cheap way, where sometimes like when a movie has a lower budget, one of the tricks that they use is using using some colorful lighting to create contrast and stuff just to make it look more expensive. And usually you can tell, but with this particular movie, the lighting actually fit the theme because they're essentially in a fun house. And the acting was actually really good. I really liked all the actors in this movie. There was sort of a weird twist in this movie that I wasn't super into, and I won't give spoilers, but like out of context with the twist, I will say that the practical effects of the makeup, whew, I definitely commend the art team on this movie because the makeup and the practical effects and the mixture of those two things, oh, mwah. So if you've already seen Coherence, this is the one that I would recommend the most besides that one. I thought it was so good. I think it's one that I'll definitely rewatch, although it was a little bit hard for me because I'm not super accustomed to the gore yet, but I did really like it in this movie. I'm actually gonna do a quick little ranking of these movies if you need to like compartmentalize which ones you want to watch first. So number one is obviously Coherence. I loved it, was obsessed with it. Number two obviously would be Haunt. I loved it. I thought it was great. Not as good as Coherence, but still a lot of fun. At number three, it's kind of difficult. I think I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna say Mayhem. I know that I said it fell a little bit flat, but I love the actors so much, and ultimately like the story and the character development was really good. So there's that. I think honestly it's kind of at a tie with the Mortuary Collection because while the Mortuary Collection does have a really good twist and ultimately the story ends up being really good, there are a lot of really ridiculous and cheesy factors to that movie. So they're kind of tied, but Mortuary Collection is probably number four. And then obviously last would be Hunted. I just flat out, I didn't like that movie. There were a lot of times when I wanted to turn it off. I just wasn't having a good time for that movie. I couldn't really figure out who the intended audience was. It was very flat, very repetitive. I just don't really recommend that one. So hopefully if you have Shudder, you have a good list of movies to watch now if you haven't seen them already. I can't believe it's been so long since I've done a video about Shudder because I need to watch movies on there more often. I have a ton of stuff on my watch list, so hopefully within the next like month or two I can make another Shudder related video. So thank you for joining me today, my lovely horror nerds. I hope that you had a good time with this video. If you want to join my Patreon, everyone in my first tier gets early access to all my videos, and if you want to join my second tier, you get a lot of bonus extra content. My social media and my vlog channel will also be linked down below if you'd like to follow me there. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye!